After you've created your SFTP account, you now have the ability to create a folder within your eLocker that will allow you to host websites. Now that folder has to have a specific name so that the college system recognizes that it is supposed to be publicly available on the web. So what we need to do now is access our eLocker and create that folder. Now, on this page, after you are given the success message that you have auto-generated your account, you're also given some configuration information, as well as some recommendations of software to use to connect to your eLocker via SFTP if you're working remotely, i.e. from home rather than in the student labs. Now, you notice this page might be a little bit dated. It recommends for Windows XP using WinSCP. Now, if you're using a Windows machine, I actually recommend against using WinSCP because I've noticed it's fallen out of support over the years, and you seem to have more connection difficulties. Now, if you're using a Mac, you obviously have a couple of choices listed within this bullet list. You can connect natively, which is a good option. And you could also connect using a software called Fetch Softworks. We'll cover that in a different tutorial. And then with Unix or Linux, the main recommendation is Filezilla. We're going to talk about how to connect via Filezilla today because Filezilla actually works for any of these platforms. So whether you're using a Windows or a Mac machine, you can connect using Filezilla. Now what I can do is control click or command click on a Mac to open Filezilla in a new browser. And you notice the page is a little bit unattractive, especially if you're a design student. So this is a good time for us to talk about making sure that you're clicking a reliable download link. So a lot of times when you get to a page like this, these links, you'll have these big buttons saying download, but they're not necessarily recommending that you download the thing you're there to download. The way that you can know is to roll over a link. And if you notice when I do, in the bottom corner of my browser window here, the URL appears that shows me the link that I'm about to visit by clicking this. And I can notice that it says filezilla-project.org and a download, type equals client. So that looks legitimate because I am on filezillaproject.org and I am trying to download Filezilla client. So I can trust that this is a reliable link and that it's not going to be any malware or any kind of spam that I'm downloading or clicking on. So when I click on it, I can then choose to download it. Again, verify that that link is coming from the same domain that you're working with right now, or that it looks like a reliable domain and a reputable domain. Now I've already done all of this, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to Filezilla. But once you download and install it, you should be able to see it in your dock and start to connect via SFTP. Now, you'll notice that this is a pretty complicated looking interface, but it's really not as bad as it seems. So what we're looking at here is my connection to my eLocker as a student. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this out and open a new instance so I can show you how I did that. And now, in order to do that, I have to find Filezilla again in my applications folder. And now when I open this new instance of Filezilla, I have to connect. Now this is where you're going to want to go back and review this connection information or the configuration information that was given to you on this page of the college website. Now if you've already closed that website page, that's not a big deal either. You can just visit sftp.cpcc.edu. The page looks a little bit different because it's within the college website, but you have the same information. You notice it's telling you about the server, host name, port, protocol, and giving you the recommendations of the different softwares as well. Now another thing it's telling you about is an RSA key. This is something you may want to take note of, and you'll see why in just a minute. Now I'm going to go back to my instance of Filezilla, and I'm going to use this information to connect. In the quick connect bar, it asked me for the host. The host was sftp.cpcc.edu. The username is your student ID, so I'm going to enter mine. This is whatever you use to log into the lab machines on campus. And then the password associated with that account. And the port. The port was 22. So when I enter all of that information and I choose Quick Connect, you notice I get a message. It's a warning that the server's host key is unknown and you don't know that you're connecting to the computer that you think you are. Now, the host is something that we recognize. It's what we just entered in, port 22 of sftp.cpcc.edu. Then you have this fingerprint. That's that RSA key. So if we go back to the website, and let me move this down where we can hopefully see both, you can check and verify that this key matches And it does. So that way you know you are actually connecting to a computer at CPCC. It's the computer that you're trying to connect to. So everything should be good. So now let's go back to Filezilla and tell it OK. And you'll notice that it connects here. Now, what we're looking at is the local site and the remote site. Okay, let's talk about what those two things mean. The local site means the folder that lives on my computer. So you notice I do have a folder in my documents called GRD180, and this is the contents of it. I can see I've got another folder in there for fall of 2016, and I've got another folder called Interactive Form. So that's for GRD180, different class. We're in GRD188. But you also notice that over here I have the remote site. The remote site is connected to my user ID. This is the home folder when you're logged into a computer at the CPCC lab. So what I've essentially done is connect to the lab server where I can get to the files within my eLocker. This can be kind of useful. If you store any files in your eLocker that you then need to get from home, you can get them from here. What I can also do is add files or remove them from here. So what I need to do in this folder is add that special folder to make a website available on my computer. Before I do that, I want to show you what happens when I don't have it. Now, your student website is going to live at a URL called students.cpcc.edu and a slash and a tilde and then your student ID. So when I enter my student ID, you notice I get an error that it's not found. This website does exist. You know, I initialized my SFTP. It's just that I don't have that special folder there to be able to host websites. That's missing. So let's go back to Filezilla, and I'm going to create a new folder within here by right-clicking or control-clicking. And I'm going to create a directory. Directory is another word for folder. And I'm going to call it www. Now I click OK. And www obviously means web. Hopefully you do pick up on that. Now let's come back and refresh this page and see what changes. You notice first we're getting a not found error. Now we're getting the index of my www folder. Now I haven't put anything in there, so there's nothing there to see, but this is a good way to check to see if you've done things right. So we go back to Filezilla, and in the instructions I told you to create a couple of folders within that folder. So the first thing we're going to do is create another directory called GRD188. I'm going to do this with no spaces and no capital letters to make it more user-friendly. This is an easier link for someone to remember and for someone to physically type in on their keyboard. So I'm going to go ahead and create that folder. And before I do that, let me also, or after I've done that, let me also demonstrate to you why we don't want spaces in those folder names. So if I come back to my browser and refresh my page, you notice my folder GRD188 is there. I see a folder icon and it's the right name. When I click on that, I can get in there. You see there's nothing there. Now, let me show you really quickly, though, why we don't use especially spaces, but we'll talk about capital letters as well. Let me rename this folder. I'm going to put a space in there. So it looks normal to you right now, and it's the way that we as humans read text, so it is, you know, a pretty common thing to want to do. Let's go back, refresh the page. Now when I click on this link, you notice here it reads well, but look up here. Look at the URL that created. A space in a URL gets translated to a % to 0. So I want you to imagine trying to tell someone to go to mywebsite.com or myspacewebsite.com. You would be telling them to go to my%20website.com instead of just mywebsite.com. Hopefully that makes sense. This is why we avoid this. This is impossible to remember. It also makes for a really unattractive and, you know, just very difficult URL to remember. So this is why we do no capital letters and spaces. Now the capital letters are just because you have to hold down Shift to type them, so it's more likely to cause an error and also just more difficult for your user to do. So as a function of user friendliness, we want to make these as easy to interact with as possible. I'm going to go back and remove that space and hit enter again. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the last folder that the instructions called for, which is a folder called images. You're going to store all the images for that website within here. So create a new directory. I'm going to name it images. And you now see that's within my GRD188 folder. You notice when I create something within a folder, that folder then has an arrow next to it where I can expand it and see what's there. Now there's nothing in it, so you're getting questions. Now this side over here is what lives on my computer, so let's be really clear about that. My local site is files and folders that are stored on my computer. You usually want to build a website locally rather than putting it on the server because it's easier for you to build and you can do it without an internet connection, and it's also faster. When you're trying to move files back and forth, sometimes there's a delay between moving them from one computer to another, so it really slows down your process when you're working on a website in the hosting space instead of locally. So what you always really want to do is work on all of your websites locally so that you can be more efficient. So now that we've created these folders, what I actually want to encourage you to do is move offline and start working on this website that we're going to build, or start setting up your files locally instead. Now, let's take a look in the Finder on my computer, and you see in my Documents folder I have these files. Let me reduce that. Okay, so I have these files. Now you notice that matches what's happening here in the Documents folder on my local site. There's an Adobe folder, GRD121, GRD180. So what I'm going to do now is create a folder on my computer, and I'm going to call it local HTML. Now, all that's saying is I'm creating websites locally here. So I'm going to store all of my websites in there. Now, when I return to my SFTP or my Filezilla instance, what I need to do to be able to see that folder is to refresh all the files and folders. Now, when I do that, you see I have a local HTML folder, but again, nothing in it because I can't expand it to see. I can, however, navigate into that folder to where I can look here. And what I want to do is make sure that local HTML and www match each other all the time. So one is basically a backup of the other. But having different names helps me to keep separate which one lives on my computer and which one lives in my eLocker, or which one lives in my web host. So what I'm going to do now is take my GRD188 folder, and I'm just going to drag it and drop it into my local directory, and it's going to copy into local HTML. And let's refresh our files and folders. And now you can see within local HTML that we have the GRD188 folder. Within the GRD188 folder, you also have an images folder. So from now on, I can actually work on building my files from my computer at home. And then when I'm done working on them, I can transfer them to my remote site so that I can actually view them as a website. So we'll pick up in the next tutorial, but hopefully you are keeping pace and able to start building websites now.